All right. Hello, everybody. How are we doing? Been a little while, but I thought that, you know, we're in what is called, in a very cliched fashion, the quote, final stretch of this presidential campaign. And therefore, you all deserve to hear from me directly because we're in the fight of our lives, or whatever the other cliches are that you could come up with to characterize the current situation. I have voted in the interests of transparency and in the interests of not being attributed with beliefs that I don't hold. I can go ahead and inform you with no trepidation that I did vote, but I left the presidential field blank. I voted on local issues. There is a marijuana legalization amendment on the ballot in New Jersey, so of course I did vote for that, but I did not vote in the presidential race, and partly that's, I guess, for journalistic or quasi-journalistic reasons. Not that I think a journalist can't vote for president and maintain some semblance of integrity. I don't believe that. But I almost feel as though getting attached to the president, insofar as voting for him or her confers some kind of attachment, is a bit of an issue just in terms of maintaining some degree of impartiality. Now, that's not to say if I felt strongly about it that I wouldn't at least consider voting for a presidential candidate. I would. But my desire to retain impartiality and not become associated with the everyday manias of American presidential discourse, insofar as it's focused on the presidency, that was not overridden by any particular desire to vote in this election. And in 2016, I didn't vote at all. And I said in 2016, and I'll say this time, that not voting in the presidential election, to me, and maybe not to others, but I'm sure that there are others who feel the same way, is not out of apathy. Clearly, as somebody who is immersed, often at my own expense, in the day-to-day furors of American politics, I'm not, given that's my situation, I'm not what I would call, in any way, apathetic as to who occupies the White House. But it's what I would call conscious abstention, in that mostly what I'm objecting to, if there's anything to be signified by my lack of voting in the presidential election, even though, like I said, I did cast a vote, I did cast a ballot in New Jersey. Mostly what I'm trying to signify is a conscious withdrawal from the incredibly excessive, to the point of, I think, causing psychological damage on a mass scale, conscious abstention from the histrionics attached to this presidential campaign, where we have both sides, and I'm not equating both sides, I'm not saying that they're morally equivalent in every respect, but both sides do have a variation of an interpretation of this race, which effectively holds that if Biden wins, it's an existential calamity, or if Trump wins, it's an existential calamity. I just don't believe that, at least on the terms put forward by the main propagators of those theories on the Democratic and Republican sides of the spectrum. It's just so unmoored from reality that, in a sense, what I can do in my small way in the respect that my vote has any significance, which it doesn't really have much, but insofar as it does, what I'm trying to convey with my lack of participation in the presidential race is a objection or repudiation of these prophecies of calamity and disaster that really, I think, obscure the true stakes of this election and obscure the problems within the American political system, and just, if nothing else, seem to just cause the populace, to the extent that they're tuned into the race, and especially the elites who are so hyper emotionally invested in this race, it causes them to pantomime this nonstop onslaught of culture war theatrics. And I don't want to participate in that, or at least I think what I can do to be best of service to the public domain is to decline to validate those culture war hysterics. And so it's not to say that I don't have a preference in the race, or I couldn't conjure up a preference if I really wanted to, but whatever preference I might or may not have is immaterial to whether voting seems warranted for my purposes. So I don't conceal my voting patterns. I've been forthright in divulging them to, if people want to hear about them, for years now. I think a big problem with journalistic objectivity as a doctrine is that there's this kind of contrived belief that if a journalist votes and then is transparent about their voting history, then that somehow compromises them. In fact, I think transparency would engender more trust, generally speaking, in journalists. But at the same time, the whole objectivity doctrine is increasingly obsolete, and it's not as though most journalists are bashful about letting you know day in, day out that they are opposed to Trump and are committed to doing what it takes to remove Trump. And likewise, I think to some degree on the pro-Trump side. So I did not vote in the presidential election, and I'm content with that choice. It's, I think, enables me, or helps to enable me on some psychic level, to not get irrationally invested in the race. And again, that's not to say that there aren't real things at stake in the outcome of the race, but I think those stakes have been so chronically exaggerated that a abstention choice in my situation is something like a counterweight to those exaggerations, which are mostly done just to get you riled up, to get you, giving money to these giant enterprises, which are presidential campaigns now. They're overflowing with money to the point that there's no chance in the world that it could ever be spent efficiently. I mean, you have Senate races now where the Democratic candidate, like Jamie Harrison in South Carolina, for example, is getting the most money ever given to a Senate candidate. And all that does is create a bonanza for consultants and for political professionals selling their wares. I mean, this is a golden opportunity for them to just cash out, and win or lose, they get that money. And so Like I said, that doesn't mean that under no circumstance would I vote in a presidential election ever again. I can fairly easily imagine myself doing so, but at least under these circumstances, it was not something that compelled me to vote one way or another. Um, and speaking of the incredible histrionics which have come to define this race, they did to some extent in 2016, but here even more so. And the difference is it's not even novel anymore. It's not even as interesting anymore. It's just this tedious routine of incessant hyperbole being shoved in your faces every single day by self interested political operators, including clearly the media, who think themselves that this is the most important election of our lifetimes. I mean, if there's anything unifying the political media class right now, it seems to be that this is the most important election in our lifetimes, or, since World War II, or even since the Civil War, or perhaps ever, maybe in all of human history, going back to the dawn of time. This is the most important thing that any of us will ever do. And I just don't really buy that for a whole variety of reasons. And so I choose not to partake. And if you choose not to partake, don't allow yourself to be shamed, especially if it's a conscious choice, if it's a reasoned choice, if you have a rationale that you can articulate with something like coherence in expressing something, I guess that's roughly similar to what I just expressed. It's not a mark of shame. It's, you know, something that you are entitled to do as a citizen. Something that I think I've mentioned before, maybe on YouTube, maybe elsewhere, is that there is a really compelling option for voting in Nevada that ought to be more widespread across the country, which is that in Nevada, you can vote for none of these. That is a codified ballot option for you. You can vote for none of these candidates. And I think that would be worthwhile to adopt nationwide. Not that I chose to abstain more as a repudiation of Biden or Trump specifically, although there's some of that. It's more repudiation of the process writ large, and this incredibly stifling conformity that propagates what I believe is a false idea as to the almost world historic existential importance of this race. Is it important? Sure. But the manner in which that importance or alleged importance is being stressed to us is like 95% propaganda. So I don't want to legitimize it. And so that's my choice. You can agree or disagree. That's your prerogative. That being said, I will, in these final 2 weeks, be putting out 2 pieces. Well, not just 2, but 2 pieces on a specific set of themes, which is a case against Biden and a case against Trump. So I'm not issuing an endorsement for any candidate. I'm issuing what you might call anti-endorsements for both candidates, or at least attempting to put forward the most rational possible case against both candidates that doesn't lapse into any of the hyperbolic excesses that are so defining as to how the popular conception of this race and these candidates has come about. So that's what I shall do. I'm going to do Biden first and then Trump. So look out for that within the next week or so, clearly. Also, I am now officially on my election-related reporting trip. When I say reporting, I'm not claiming that I'm doing some kind of mind blowing investigative journalism here. I'm doing similar to what I did over the summer in the post riot situation, where I'm just kind of going around taking the temperature of the populace, talking to people, visit some field offices, that kind of thing, and just give you my impressions of how the race is shaking out. I don't think that the conditions of this race are really that comparable to 2016, or at least the easy invocation of 2016 as a precedent to what this race is shaping up to be seems quite off to me. Um, like I'm in Scranton, Pennsylvania right now. This is sort of my first stop, and just eyeballing it. Not that this is that dispositive. It isn't dispositive really of anything, but just casually observing. I have been a little bit surprised to see that the Trump to Biden ratio, just in terms of signage, just in terms of overt displays of quote enthusiasm on windowsills and yards and bumper stickers and stuff. It's pretty even. And I would have maybe thought that it would be a little bit more skewed to Trump, just because if Biden wins, it's not going to be because people are personally enthusiastic about him so much as they're enthusiastic about removing Trump. And so that's my first stop. I haven't done a video in, I don't know, maybe 2 weeks, because I wanted to focus on finishing a longstanding endeavor of mine, or at least the first major step in that endeavor. And if I'm sounding cryptic, that's intentional, because I can't, or I don't want to be any more revealing than that now, but just try to be rest assured that it's not for no reason that I'm not revealing the full scope of what I was working on. But I did more or less finish that. And now the next 2 weeks will be devoted to campaign-related reporting, and observations, analysis, what have you. And you will be along for the ride. I did have a piece that came out on Sunday night at Unheard, UNHERD, about one of these hyperbolic excesses that really grinds my gears. And you'd think that it would grind the gears of most rational people, but apparently it has not, which is that, I don't know, do you recall like maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago when much of the media, much of the punditocracy, much of the social media chatter was preoccupied with this apparently grave certainty that there would be a civil war upon the conclusion of the election, because either Trump would lose and refuse to leave office, or he would command legions of white supremacist militias to engage in some kind of nationwide armed insurgency. I mean, there are examples in the New York Times, in the Washington Post, in the White House press corps, all across media, Twitter. I only gave a couple examples in this Unheard piece, which of course I'll link to in the description box, but I could have come up with many, many more. And it's like sheer lunacy. I know there are some there are some easily excitable right wingers who are also convinced that some kind of civil war is potentially imminent. But the reason why it became such a thing 2 or 3 weeks ago is because like the center of the political spectrum, center left, elite portions of our esteemed prognosticators who tell us what to think were churning out these prophecies that there was a civil war, or that a civil war was like reasonably likely in November. And it's so far detached from actually existing political conditions you have to come up with a different explanation for why those prophecies were issued. And I contend that they're issued for the same reason or for a similar reason that so many blinkered and fevered prophecies have been issued throughout the presidency of Trump and dating back to 2016, which is that the reaction to Trump is by and large much more a projection of the insecurities and angst of elites than it is about Trump himself. Because if you're still being this hyper reactive and this overly emotional to every passing Trump quip, then you've been, in a way, snookered by him. I mean, you're revealing that your psyche has been given over to him in a way that almost ironically magnifies his mystique. Like, I don't think that Trump even has it within his power to command an armed insurgency, even if he wanted to, and it's not at all clear that that's something that he would want to do. Is it possible that he could dispute the results of the election on a variety of legal grounds? Sure, but these apocalyptic projections of what's going to happen post-election, again, you'd almost think that the United States is like comparable to Syria or something, or it's not the world's leading hegemonic power, and therefore probably not susceptible to civil war. Now, is the United States in terminal hegemonic decline? Yeah, it is. But it's not like an easy A to B sequence where that automatically leads to this overnight descent into armed conflict or civil war. And in the post-election period, if there's like a random event that constitutes some form of election-related unrest, look, that's not going to be adequate to justify the Civil War thesis, because in a country of 330 million, you'd expect a handful now and then to engage in wacky behavior. And of course, that gets amplified hugely by social media, and everybody reacts, and it almost becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way. But no, tell me if you disagree, but traveling around the country, I don't get the sense that people are gearing up for civil war. And in fact, the pundits who prophesied it aren't even themselves preparing for civil war. They don't believe their own rhetoric. That's the kind of fundamental scam of all this, or the fraudulent conceit of what they're saying. Like, if you truly believe that a civil war was potentially imminent, like let's say there was a 30% chance of it, why aren't you stockpiling food? Why aren't you engaging in training for like armed combat or hand-to-hand combat or something? Why aren't you taking dramatic steps that would be consonant with the projections that you're throwing out into the public sphere for mass consumption? It's because they don't really believe it. They're so psychologically warped that maybe on some level they've convinced themselves that they really believe it, but if it doesn't manifest in their own actions, that's a hint that it's all for effect, or it's all for show. And so that is my diagnosis of that wave of hysteria. And I'm assuming that there will be additional waves of hysteria as we approach the election in 2 weeks. Now, one definite manifestation of this hysteria, which probably will get worse as the election draws near, is this idea that Russian disinformation is somehow underway and is crippling our elections infrastructure and is duping Americans to believe false things, etc. It was the inevitable consequence of 4 years of Russiagate-related propaganda, which is so deeply instilled now into the media and political spheres that they regurgitate its fallacious premises almost without prompting. And the Hunter Biden story is a definite example of that, where it was just assumed with no evidence that the Hunter Biden emails that were published by the New York Post, in addition to photos and other things, were Russian disinformation. Like, that was the starting journalistic premise that journalists used in their commentary on that subject. The only problem is there's, again, zero evidence whatsoever to indicate that this is Russian disinformation, except for that so many of these people have been trained preemptively to automatically just, again, assume that Russian disinformation could be the only reason why these materials were put into the public domain. And I'm not even saying that the Hunter Biden materials are unto themselves like blockbuster stories, or even that revelatory. They're revelatory in certain ways, but more illuminating about that entire episode last week going into this week was that there was this mass effort on the part of media elites and political elites to discount the veracity of that material on the basis of a theory that they had ginned up well in advance, which is that Russian disinformation was going to be something that was put into effect for the purposes of reelecting Trump. And again, is there any evidence for those theories? No, but it doesn't matter because they've been so trained and propagandistically primed to this end that evidence doesn't even factor into the equation. And so I think that much more so than the Hunter Biden materials themselves, the more long-lasting significance of that entire episode was how easily or how reflexively materials of this nature can be deemed quote-unquote disinformation at the drop of a hat on the basis of nothing except elite conjecture. And so that is ominous. Ironically, the claims of disinformation that came about in relation to these materials are themselves disinformation. Again, disinformation is not a term with like a coherent definition. It's been weaponized to advance the interest of whoever is leveling the accusation. But if you're calling something disinformation on the basis of no evidence, then you are yourself being disinformative. So it's this bizarre propagandistic inversion of the concept of disinformation to almost even stigmatize ordinary people who are, say, sharing a link or discussing what's contained in those emails. Because if you're doing that, then as per the logic of this disinformation thesis, you are abetting the disinformation campaigns. That's what's so obnoxious and pernicious about the reflexive attribution of disinformation to anything that seems politically inconvenient, is that it implicates regular people. Because, again, just chattering away on social media about something that's been classified as disinformation makes you complicit, supposedly, in the disinformation enterprise. And that's very much disturbing. So that's the main takeaway. It's almost like a meta takeaway from the Hunter Biden episode that transcends whatever was supposedly revealed by that hard drive. And by the way, the Biden campaign, Hunter Biden's representatives, anybody who would be in a position to know has not even denied the authenticity of those materials, which is why it's so almost mind-blowing that disinformation became the reflex rebuttal to the promulgation of that disinformation. You think that if forgeries were going around in your name, or my name. I know for my purposes, if I all of a sudden woke up one morning and there were emails that were presented as being authored by me that were not, that were fabrications or forgeries, that would be the first thing I would say. Was I would say, no, absolutely not. These are not mine. This is a forgery. But nobody in the Biden campaign or Hunter Biden or anybody has said anything like that, which is probably a tacit admission that they're real, and there's every reason to believe they're real. There's no reason, no evidence to believe that they're the product of Russian disinformation, and yet here we are, and the elite media class has successfully convinced much of the public that this is pure Russian disinformation. And that is, in a way, something that I have to reckon with, which is that it's a propagandistic triumph. It shows that Russiagate was effective in instilling in the populace these reflexes, where, again, anything that seems politically inconvenient can just be erased if you can call it Russian disinformation. And then if your friends and allies in the quote unquote intelligence community or the former intelligence official network who are clearly anti-Trump, if they can, corroborate your speculations, then it just becomes fact. I mean, you'll notice that most of the time when this stuff has been discussed, it's not even that they're not even like hedging anymore. They're not even saying that it's possibly Russian disinformation. Much of the time, you'll see that they'll just say it is Russian disinformation. What's the basis for that? Pretty much nothing, except that there was so much hysteria in the years preceding this election that it almost becomes this robotic response that all right-minded journalists, pundits, and citizens are expected to demonstrate when quote unquote hack material like this comes across the transom. And so I'm sure we'll see further episodes that are comparably insane as these next 2 weeks unfold. So I'll be here with you in the meantime to offer my biting commentary every step of the way. Okay, so I'm going to check some super chats. Thanks, of course, as usual, to all my super chat contributors. Brad asks if I've been reading Moldbug, aka Curtis Yarvin, because he's been advocating what I've been talking about in probably the most intelligent and accessible way I've ever encountered. I'm familiar with Moldbug, clearly. It's, if you've been at all engaged in online right-wing political discourse over the past number of years, it's pretty likely that you'll have encountered him. And, I think I'm not... I think generally I read across the political spectrum to just have the best sense possible of what people on the left, right, everywhere in between are thinking and what effects their beliefs might have on overall discourse. And you can take insights from the left and the right most of the time that can be helpful in terms of, again, developing a sense of contemporary political discourse. So in that sense, it's possible to derive value from somebody like a Moldbug, if only insofar as to detect what kind of influence he's had on people who are now wielding some degree of discursive power. But whether he is advocating what I've been talking about, it's kind of a vague postulation. I'm not sure that I would necessarily affirm that, but yes, I'm familiar enough with him. Krillin asks, any news from Brett Weinstein's show? Not that I'm aware of. I pretty much do any show within reason. I have been. I don't. I guess I don't. I doubt he would have any trouble with me saying this here. I have been asked fairly repeatedly to go on the Tim Pool show, which I agreed to do because I agreed to do pretty much any show within reason. Um, but I do have to physically go to him in the DC area, which I haven't been in that region for quite a while. But um, probably what I'm going to do on this trip is I'm in Pennsylvania now. Probably going to go south from here to North Carolina, Georgia, Florida. And so on the way there, if it all works out logistically, I will do the Tim Pool show. I saw that he just announced that he is in fact voting for Trump, so that would be something where I don't agree, just in terms of that's not what my voting action was this time around. So maybe that could be an interesting discussion, and we shall see. Okay, everybody. Thank you for tuning in, and we will do it again soon. You know what the send off is on these dumpy little streams. Typically, it's stay safe, stay cool, vote or don't. It's up to you. Bye bye.